You know, when you picture the British conquest of India, your mind probably jumps straight to battlefields.
Right, the typical imagery.
Yeah, like roaring cannons, redcoat infantry, cavalry charges.
Mhm.
But the truth is, the dual weapons of British conquest in India weren't just swords and cannons, they were ledgers and laws.
Exactly. I mean, the real subjugation didn't actually happen on the battlefield. It happened on paper.
Wow.
It was orchestrated by bureaucrats and, accountants and lawmakers sitting in offices thousands of miles away, basically treating a massive subcontinent like a corporate spreadsheet.
That is such a wild way to look at it.
Mm.
Welcome to this custom deep dive into the economic and administrative policies of British India.
Me.
And look, if you're listening right now, we know you aren't here for just some basic history lecture.
Definitely not.
You're here for a highly targeted strategy session. We're pulling from Spectrum Modern History, the Civil's Daily Previous Year Question Micro-Themes.
The PYQs, yeah.
Right, in the P&P notes. Our mission today is to uncover the mechanics of colonial control, specifically looking at how the examiner tests your understanding of these hidden bureaucratic weapons.
Yeah, we're going to break down the structure of how this wealth was extracted. We'll start by looking at the raw economics, like the plunder by ledger, and then we'll examine the administrative and legal cage that made that plunder possible.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the British Empire, you really have to follow the money.
Always.
And to follow the money, you have to understand this massive structural shift in how the British viewed India. We're talking about the move from mercantilism to one-way free trade. But what does that actually mean in practice?
Well, in the early days, under mercantilism, the East India Company operated like a traditional trading monopoly, right?
Right.
They wanted to buy Indian goods, so spices, silk, and those incredibly popular textiles, as cheaply as possible, and then sell them in Europe for a massive profit.
Buy low, sell high.
Yeah. Exactly. But then the Industrial Revolution completely flipped that dynamic. Suddenly, Britain had factories churning out thousands of yards of machine-made cloth every single day.
So they didn't need to import Indian textiles anymore.
Right. They actually needed the opposite. They needed a captive market to buy their manufactured goods, and they needed a massive farm to supply the raw materials, like cotton and indigo.
So the biggest source of money to fund this whole operation in a pre-industrial society is, well, land. The British needed revenue from Indian agriculture to fund their own trade and military expansion, which leads us to the first major structural change in land ownership.
The permanent settlement.
Yes, introduced by Lord Cornwallis in 1793. Now, why did he do this? From what I'm reading, the East India Company was bleeding money, facing financial collapse, and they just needed a guaranteed stable income.
That's the core of it. Yeah.
But exactly how did they structure this to get that stability?
Well, before Cornwallis, the British had this chaotic system of auctioning off revenue collection rights to the highest bidder every few years.
Sounds like a mess.
Oh, it was incredibly chaotic. It led to the total ruin of the agriculture sector because, no one wanted to invest in the land if they might lose it next year.
Makes sense.
So Cornwallis, who, came from the British landed aristocracy, he believed society needed a loyal class of wealthy landlords to function properly.
So he looked at the local zamindars.
Right. And historically, the zamindars were just tax collectors for the Mughals. But overnight, Cornwallis legally transformed them into the absolute hereditary owners of the land.
That is a staggering shift.
Yep.
Like just with a stroke of a pen.
Yep.
And the underlying mechanism here is the revenue split. So the zamindar collected the rent from the peasants, kept 1/11 for himself, and had to hand over 10/11 to the British state.
Exactly. And that demand was fixed permanently.
But the impact on the peasants,
Mm.
it was devastating, right?
Yeah.
They were stripped of all their traditional customary land rights.
Completely. They were reduced to mere tenants on land their families had farmed for literally centuries. It caused severe agrarian distress.
Because the initial tax rate was so high.
Yeah, because the British knew they could never raise the tax rate in the future, right? So they set that initial fixed demand absurdly high. The zamindars had to squeeze the peasants dry with illegal extra dues just to meet the British quota.
And if they failed to meet it, because this is a fascinating piece of misdirection you'll see in the exams, especially the 2024 paper.
Oh, the sunset clause. It's a huge trap.
Right. The examiner asks, what happened if the zamindar failed to pay his revenues to the state on or before the fixed date? It's so easy to assume they got a warning or a fine or, just paid interest.
But the reality was far more ruthless. Under the sunset clause, if the payment wasn't made by sunset on the fixed date, the zamindar was immediately stripped of his title.
Just like that.
Just like that, and his entire estate was auctioned off to the highest bidder. No excuses accepted.
Brutal. So Cornwallis creates these zamindars, but within a few decades, the British realized they've kind of played themselves. Well, as agriculture expanded and prices rose, the zamindars got richer. But because the tax rate was permanently fixed, the East India Company wasn't seeing a dime of that new profit.
Ah, yes.
So they needed a new system where they could take all the surplus. Enter the Rayatwari system.
Oh, right. Introduced by Thomas Monro and Alexander Red around 1820, mostly down in Madras and Bombay.
And the logic here is different, right?
Very different. It's deeply tied to European economic theory. Officials like Monro were heavily influenced by David Ricardo's theory of rent.
Which basically says what?
Ricardo argued that the rent collected by landlords was essentially unearned income. So the British officials looked at the wealthy zamindars in Bengal and concluded, well, we are losing out.
So they cut out the middleman.
Exactly. They decided to eliminate the middleman entirely so the state could absorb all that surplus directly.
So the defining shift of Rayatwari is that the settlement was made directly with the peasant, or the Rayat.
Yes.
But wait, if I'm understanding the mechanics correctly, the tax wasn't based on what the peasant actually harvested that year, right? It was based on the potential yield of the soil.
That is the cruel genius of the system, honestly. They surveyed the land, analyzed the soil quality, and calculated what the land ought to produce under ideal conditions.
Wow.
And then they set the tax at like 50 to 60% of that hypothetical yield. Whether it actually rained or whether locusts destroyed the crop, completely irrelevant to the tax collector.
Yeah, so it's essentially like firing a corrupt debt collector, but making the bank itself twice as ruthless.
That is a perfect analogy, and worse, the bank doesn't care if your business burns down.
Yeah.
To pay these exorbitant taxes in hard cash, peasants were forced to take loans from local moneylenders at staggering interest rates. I mean, sometimes hitting 500%.
Which leads right into another devious trap from the 2024 paper. The question asks if peasants were exempted from revenue payment during bad harvests or natural calamities under the Rayatwari system.
And what's the logical guess?
The logical, humane guess is yes, or at least that they received an extension. But the historical reality is zero exemptions. They had to pay regardless.
Which is exactly how millions of peasants fell into a debt spiral and lost their land to urban moneylenders.
All right. So now, as the British expanded into the northwestern provinces and Punjab, they realized neither of these systems would work. Which brings us to the Mahalwari system, introduced by Holt Mackenzie in 1822.
Yeah, because they couldn't just impose individual ownership up north.
Because the social structure was vastly different, right? They had strong, customary communal landholding systems.
Exactly. The British had to adapt to the local reality to avoid total rebellion. So under Mahalwari, the revenue unit became the Mahal, which usually meant a village or a group of villages.
Okay.
And the settlement was made with the village headman.
So mechanically, what this meant was collective responsibility. The whole village was liable for the tax. If one farmer's crop failed, the rest of the village had to cover his share.
Yeah, but the financial impact was just as crushing. Initially, the British demanded 90% of the net produce.
90%, that's insane.
Right. Even when they later realized this was mathematically impossible and reduced it to 60%, it was still based on highly inaccurate surveys.
And a classic area of confusion here for the exam is mixing up Rayatwari and Mahalwari. It really all comes down to liability.
Exactly. Rayatwari is individual peasant liability. Mahalwari is collective village liability.
Okay, let's zoom out from the land itself and look at the broader economic impacts of these three systems. We have commercialization of agriculture, deindustrialization, and the drain of wealth.
Huge topics.
Let's start with commercialization. When we say that, it sounds like farmers were happily deciding to grow cash crops for extra profit. But that's not what was happening at all, was it?
Not even close. It was a forced structural shift.
Because of the cash demand.
Exactly. Because the British now demanded land revenue in hard currency, peasants couldn't just grow food to feed their families and trade the surplus locally. They had to grow crops that the global market, specifically British factories, wanted to buy.
So we're talking about indigo, raw cotton, jute, tea.
Right. And tying Indian peasants to global market fluctuations seems, well, it is incredibly dangerous. When the American Civil War ended, global cotton prices crashed, and Indian farmers were instantly ruined.
And worse, by replacing food crops with cash crops, the the British engineered massive vulnerability to famines. You had situations where millions of Indians were starving to death while the country was simultaneously exporting grain to Europe.
It's tragic. And alongside that agricultural crisis, you have deindustrialization. Now, this wasn't an accidental byproduct of superior British technology.
It wasn't.
No, it was the deliberate ruin of Indian artisans through tariff manipulation. In the 1700s, India was an industrial powerhouse, exporting fine textiles globally.
Right, earlier we mentioned one-way free trade. How did that actually work? Because free trade sounds, fair on the surface.
But it was entirely asymmetrical. British machine-made goods were allowed to flood into the Indian market completely tax-free.
Okay.
But if an Indian weaver tried to sell his superior cloth in Britain, he faced massive, prohibitive tariffs under the Calico Acts, effectively banning Indian textiles from the European market.
So they killed the demand for Indian goods while flooding India with cheap British substitutes.
Exactly. And the knock-on effect of that is devastating, really. When the traditional handicraft industries were destroyed, millions of skilled artisans lost their livelihoods.
And with the factories being in Europe, they had nowhere to go.
Right, so they were forced to fall back on agriculture. This massive demographic shift back to the villages is called mass ruralization,
Which pushed everyone onto an already overburdened land sector, setting the stage for total economic collapse.
What's fascinating here is that it's a vicious cycle that culminates in the concept of the drain of wealth, a theory famously articulated by Dadabhai Naoroji.
Oh, yes.
And the central mechanism of this theory is the idea of an unrequited surplus.
Unrequited surplus, meaning wealth was leaving India, but there was absolutely no equivalent economic return.
Precisely.
Because if a country exports goods and gets gold or technology or services in return, that's just standard international trade. But India was essentially exporting its wealth just to pay for the privilege of being conquered.
And a major channel for this drain was a ledger item called home charges. And this is where the audacity of the colonial system really shows.
Okay, lay it on me.
The examiner often asks what constituted these home charges, like in the 2011 paper. It included funds used to support the India office in London and the salaries and pensions of British personnel working in India.
Wait, let me get this straight. The British took out loans to fund their military campaigns to conquer Indian territory.
Yeah.
And then they forced the newly conquered Indian subjects to pay the interest on the very debt used to conquer them.
Yep, and they called it a home charge. They even made Indians pay the pensions of the generals who violently annexed their territories. It's an administrative masterclass in extortion.
That is just unbelievable. Okay, so that is the economic engine, the plunder by ledger. But to efficiently extract all this wealth without facing constant uprisings, the British needed a bulletproof legal and administrative cage. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's transition to how they built that cage.
The evolution of these administrative policies is essentially the story of the British Parliament slowly swallowing the East India Company.
Swallowing it.
Yeah, because in the mid-1700s, the company was acting like a rogue state. They were a private corporation with their own army running a massive subcontinent, and their officials were getting obscenely rich while the company itself was somehow going bankrupt.
Which brings us to the Regulating Act of 1773, passed during Warren Hastings' tenure. The context here is crucial, right? Bengal had just suffered a devastating famine in 1770, where a third of the population died. Yet company officials were still sending home massive dividends.
The British public and Parliament were totally horrified by the unchecked greed. So the 1773 Act is Parliament's first attempt to put a leash on the company.
And the structural changes are critical to understand here.
Right. The governor of Bengal was elevated to the Governor-General of Fort William, giving him supervisory authority over the Madras and Bombay presidencies.
Okay.
And to establish some semblance of legal order over the corrupt officials, it established the Supreme Court at Calcutta.
But the impact was pretty messy, right? It ended the dual government system Robert Clive had set up, but it completely failed to curb corruption.
He was very messy. The Governor-General was constantly outvoted by his own new council, and the Supreme Court's jurisdiction was so vaguely defined that it basically just fought with everyone.
And here is a great historical quirk the examiner uses as a trap.
Oh, the police thing.
Exactly. The 1773 Act established a Supreme Court. But in a 2005 paper, they tried to trick candidates into thinking this act, and Warren Hastings established the regular police force.
It's a very subtle distinction. Hastings pioneered the concept of dealing with law and order, but it was Cornwallis years later who actually formalized and organized the modern police system with circles and darogas.
Right. So because the 1773 Act was so functionally flawed, Parliament had to try again a decade later. This gives us Pitt's India Act of 1784.
The explicit goal here was to fix the glaring administrative loopholes. They created a system of dual government back in England.
So they split the oversight of the company.
Yes. The British Crown appointed a board of control to handle all political and military affairs in India. Meanwhile, the company's court of directors was left to handle purely commercial trade affairs.
Think about the irony of that.
Yeah.
You have a corporate board of directors and a government cabinet attempting to co-manage a subcontinent. But the ultimate impact of the 1784 Act was clear. The East India Company officially became a subordinate, heavily regulated department of the British state. The illusion of an independent merchant company was completely shattered.
And once Parliament had its foot in the door, they used the company's charter renewals, which happened every 20 years, to tighten the leash.
So let's examine the mechanics of the three major charter acts, 1813, 1833, and 1853, starting with 1813. We talked earlier about the Industrial Revolution changing the economic game.
Yeah, British manufacturers had all these new factory-made goods, and they aggressively lobbied Parliament for access to the Indian market. They absolutely hated that the East India Company had a monopoly.
So the 1813 Act stripped the East India Company of its general trade monopoly, except in two highly lucrative areas.
Right, trade in tea and trade with China. It also explicitly asserted the British Crown's sovereignty over the Indian territories for the first time.
And there's a trap here from the 2019 paper. Did the 1813 Act assert Crown sovereignty? Yes. But did Parliament itself take direct control of the revenues of India through this act?
No.
Exactly. The revenues were still controlled by the Board of Control, which had been established back in 1784. The examiner loves to blur the lines between these acts.
They really do. Now, 20 years later, the empire had expanded massively. The Charter Act of 1833, passed under Lord William Bentinck, was all about total centralization.
So the Governor-General of Bengal was officially redesignated as the Governor-General of India.
Right, giving one man unprecedented authority over the entire subcontinent.
Now, I've always found this next part confusing. The 1833 Act put a complete end to all commercial functions of the company.
Yeah.
Weren't they literally the East India Trading Company? Why would Parliament stop them from trading entirely?
Because by 1833, the extraction of land revenue and the administration of the territory were far more valuable to the British state than the company's actual shipping business.
Oh, wow.
The company was transformed from a merchant enterprise into a pure administrative and governing proxy for the British Crown.
That makes perfect sense. And for anyone listening, the 2023 paper specifically targets this timeline. You must know that 1833 is the peak of centralization and the creation of the Governor-General of India. Not 1773, not 1813.
Important distinction. And by the time we get to the Charter Act of 1853, the administration was just incredibly complex.
Because it's too much for one person.
Exactly. The 1853 Act recognized that one man and his council couldn't do everything. So the structural shift here was the separation of the executive and legislative wings of the Governor-General's Council.
So it effectively created a mini parliament in India for the first time.
Yes. It also finally threw open the civil services to open competition, theoretically ending the company's old boys club of patronage.
All right, so we've seen how they built the legal structure. But how did the British actually conquer all this territory to govern in the first place without, bankrupting themselves with endless wars?
Right.
That brings us to two brilliant, insidious pieces of statecraft. First, the subsidiary alliance, introduced by Lord Wellesley in 1798.
Wellesley weaponized a concept that the French had actually pioneered earlier. The goal was twofold. Keep the French from gaining any influence among Indian rulers.
Because the French were always a threat.
Exactly, and expand British control without the massive financial burden of a direct war.
Mechanically, the subsidiary alliance operated like a mafia protection racket. If an Indian ruler signed this treaty, they had to completely disband their own native armies.
Yep.
Instead, they had to permanently station British troops in their territory. But here's the catch. The Indian ruler had to pay for the upkeep of those British troops. Furthermore, they had to surrender all their external diplomacy to a British resident stationed at their court.
And the impact was the total loss of sovereignty. These princes became financially crippled puppets. The massive cost of paying for the British Army drained their treasuries, which naturally led to internal misgovernance.
Let me guess.
The British would then conveniently use that misgovernance as an excuse to annex the state entirely later on.
It's so cyclical. And this sets up a great hook from a 2018 paper. The examiner asked if the subsidiary alliance was designed to secure a fixed income for the company.
And that sounds incredibly plausible given everything we've discussed about land revenue.
But it's a trap. The actual intent wasn't a fixed corporate income. It was to maintain a massive standing army at the expense of others and to establish absolute British paramountcy over the princely states.
Right. And if the subsidiary alliance crippled the states financially, the doctrine of lapse, formalized by Lord Dalhousie between 1848 and 1856, well, it finished them off.
Dalhousie wanted aggressive annexation to maximize direct British control, mostly to ensure a steady supply of raw cotton and to facilitate the building of the railways.
Exactly.
The mechanism of this doctrine attacked the very core of succession. If an Indian ruler died without a natural biological male heir, his kingdom lapsed, meaning it defaulted directly to the East India Company.
According to centuries of Hindu tradition, a ruler without a son could legally adopt an heir to inherit the throne and perform religious duties.
But Dalhousie didn't care about that.
Not at all. Dalhousie essentially said, the adopted son can inherit your personal wealth and your palace, but he cannot inherit the political state. The state belongs to Britain now.
It's like a rigged corporate hostile takeover, where the bylaws suddenly say if the CEO dies, the rival company gets all the shares.
That's a great way to put it.
The impact was explosive. It led to the rapid annexation of major states like Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur. It created a massive, seething resentment among the traditional elites.
And just a quick historical quirk here. Dalhousie didn't actually invent this doctrine.
He didn't.
No. Earlier rulers had occasionally used similar concepts. Dalhousie just weaponized it as an unyielding state policy of aggressive expansion.
Wow.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Dalhousie's total disregard for Indian traditions of succession was the final structural shock. The resulting explosion in 1857 forced the British Crown to finally step in, take direct control, and end the East India Company's rule forever.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of complex machinery today. Let's lock this in. We are pivoting to a rapid-fire revision of how these concepts connect.
Let's do it.
First, mapping the revenue systems to their core liabilities.
Permanent settlement is zamindar ownership and permanently fixed revenue. Raitwari eliminates the middleman for direct settlement with the individual peasant, and Mahawari relies on the collective liability of the whole village.
Next, anchoring the key personalities to their primary policies.
Lord Cornwallis engineered the permanent settlement. Thomas Monroe and Alexander Reed developed the Raitwari system. Lord Wellesley weaponized the subsidiary alliance. And Lord Dalhousie formalized the doctrine of lapse.
Beautiful. Finally, the top 5 major traps to watch out for. Number 1, the Raitwari versus Mahawari liability confusion.
Remember the scale. Raitwari targets the individual. Mahawari targets the entire village group.
Number 2, the chronology of the acts.
1773 establishes the Supreme Court to rein in corruption. 1813 ends the trade monopoly to satisfy the Industrial Revolution, except for tea in China. And 1833 is peak centralization, creating the Governor-General of India and ending the company's trade entirely.
Number 3, the police formalization mismatch.
Warren Hastings originated the police concept, but do not confuse him with Cornwallis, who formally organized the actual police system.
Number 4, the true intent of the subsidiary alliance.
It was primarily about making Indian states pay for the maintenance of British standing armies, establishing paramountcy. It was not just securing a fixed corporate income.
And number 5, famine relief under the Raitwari system.
There was none. Riots received 0 exemptions during bad harvest. They paid the cash or they lost their land to moneylenders.
Brilliant. So what does this all mean for you as you process this material? We've traced the journey from extracting wealth via merciless land systems to locking down total control via the Charter Acts and alliances.
It's a huge journey.
It is. Understanding this period means realizing that the British Empire was built on administrative paperwork, legal technicalities, and economic extraction, just as much as it was built on gunpowder.
This raises an important question, though.
Oh.
Yeah, looking at all these administrative policies, the extreme centralization, the creation of the postal service, the telegraphs, the railways built under Dalhousie.
The infrastructure of empire.
Right. The British built these massive infrastructural systems purely to drain wealth efficiently and speed up their military annexations. But consider the profound historical irony of those mechanics.
What do you mean?
How fascinating is it that these very tools, the trains carrying mail across the subcontinent, the telegraph wires spreading news of uprisings, became the exact network that allowed Indian revolutionaries to communicate, unite, and ultimately dismantle that same British Empire?
That is incredible. The ledgers and laws built the empire, but they also laid the exact tracks for its destruction. Something to think about as you review your notes. Good luck with the material, and keep diving deep.